Jacob August Riis was a Danish American social reformer, muckraking journalist and social documentary photographer. He is known for using his photographic and journalistic talents to help the impoverished in New York City. Those impoverished New Yorkers were the subject of most of his prolific writings and photography. He endorsed the implementation of model tenements in New York with the help of humanitarian Lawrence Vaillant. Additionally, as one of the most famous proponents of the newly practicable casual photography, he is considered one of the fathers of photography due to his very early adoption of flash-in photography. While living in New York, Riis experienced poverty and became a police reporter writing about the quality of life in the slums. He attempted to alleviate the bad living conditions of poor people by exposing their living conditions to the middle and upper classes. Biography: Early life. Born in Ribe, Denmark, Jacob Riis was the third of the 15 children of Niels Edward Riis, a schoolteacher and occasional writer for the local Ribe newspaper, and Carolina Riis, a homemaker. Among the 15, only Jacob, one sister and the foster sister survived into the 20th century. Riis was influenced by his father, whose school Riis delighted in disrupting, and who persuaded him to read Charles Dickens's magazine all the year round and the novels of James Fenimore Cooper. Jacob had a happy childhood, but experienced tragedy at the age of 11 when his brother Theodore, a year younger than he, drowned. He never forgot his mother's grief. At age 11 or 12 years, he donated all the money he had and gave it to a poor Ribe family living in a squalid house, on condition that they cleaned it. The tenants took the money and obliged. When he told his mother, she went to help. Although his father had hoped that Jacob would have a literary career, Jacob wanted to be a carpenter. When he was 16 years old, he became fond of Elizabeth Kjartz, the 12-year-old adopted daughter of the owner of the company for which he worked as an apprentice carpenter. The father disapproved of the boy's blundering attentions, and Riis was forced to complete his carpentry apprenticeship in Copenhagen. Riis returned to Ribe in 1868 at age 19. Discouraged by poor job availability in the region and by Kjartz's disfavor of his marriage proposal, Riis decided to emigrate to the United States. Migration to the United States: Riis immigrated to America in 1870, when he was 21 years old, seeking employment as a carpenter. He first traveled in a small boat from Copenhagen to Glasgow, where on May 18 he boarded the steamer Iowa, traveling in steerage. He carried $40 donated by friends. A gold locket with a strand of Elizabeth's hair, presented by her mother. And letters of introduction to the Danish consul, Mr. Goodall, a friend of the family since his rescue from a shipwreck at Ribe. Riis disembarked in New York on June 5, on that day spending half of the $40 his friends had given him on a revolver for defense against human or animal predators. The demographics of American urban areas became significantly more heterogeneous as many immigrants arrived, creating ethnic enclaves often more populous than many of the cities of their homelands. Large groups of migrants and immigrants, seeking prosperity in a more industrialized environment, came to urban areas during the years after the American Civil War. 24 million people relocated to urban areas, causing their population to increase eightfold. In the 1880s 334,000 people were crammed into a single square mile of the Lower East Side, making it the most densely populated place on Earth. They were packed into filthy, disease-ridden tenements, 10 or 15 to a room, and the well-off knew nothing about them and cared less. After 5 days, during which he used almost all his money, Riis found work as a carpenter at Brady's Bend Iron Works on the Allegheny River above Pittsburgh. After a few days of that he began mining for increased pay, but quickly resumed carpentry. Learning on July 19, 1870, that France had declared war on Germany, he expected that Denmark would join France to avenge the Prussian seizure of Schleswig, and determined to fight for France. He returned to New York, and, having pawned most of his possessions and without money, attempted to enlist at the French consulate, but was told that there was no plan to send a volunteer army from America. Pawning his revolver, he walked out of New York until he collapsed from exhaustion. On waking, he walked to Fordham College where a Catholic priest served him breakfast. After a brief period of farm working and odd jobs at Mount Vernon, New York. Riis returned to New York, where he read in the newspaper New York Sun that the newspaper was recruiting soldiers for the war. Riis rushed there to enlist, but the editor claimed or affected ignorance but offered the famished Riis $1 for breakfast. Riis indignantly refused. Riis was destitute, at one time sleeping on a tombstone and surviving on windfall apples. Still, he found work at a brickyard at Little Washington in New Jersey, and was there for 6 weeks until he heard that a group of volunteers was going to the war. Thereupon he left for New York. On arrival, Riis found that the rumor was true but that he had arrived too late. He pleaded with the French consul, who expelled him. He made various other attempts to enlist, none successful. As autumn began, Riis was destitute, without a job. He survived on scavenged food and handouts from Delmonico's restaurant and slept in public areas or in a foul-smelling police lodging house. At one time Riis' only companion was his stray dog. One morning he awoke in a lodging house to find that his gold locket had been stolen. He complained to the sergeant, who became enraged and expelled him. Riis was devastated. The story became a favorite of Riis. One of his personal victories, he later confessed, was not using his eventual fame to ruin the career of the offending officer. Disgusted, he left New York, buying a passage on a ferry with the silk handkerchief that was his last possession. By doing odd jobs and stowing away on freight trains, Riis eventually reached Philadelphia, where he appealed to the Danish consul, Ferdinand Millertz, for help and was cared for 2 weeks by the consul and his wife. Millertz sent Riis, now dressed properly in a suit, to the home of an old classmate in Jamestown. Riis worked as a carpenter in Scandinavian communities in the western part of the state, also working a variety of other jobs. He achieved sufficient financial stability to find the time to experiment as a writer, in both Danish and English, although his attempt to get a job at a Buffalo, New York newspaper was unsuccessful, and magazines rejected his submissions. Riis was in much demand as a carpenter, a major reason being the low prices he charged. However, his employers exploited his efficiency and low prices, and Riis returned to New York City. He was most successful as a salesman, particularly of flat irons and fluting irons, becoming promoted to sales representative of them for Illinois. However, in Chicago he was cheated of both his money and his stock, and had to return to an earlier base in Pittsburgh. There he found that his subordinates he had left to sell in Pennsylvania had cheated him in the same manner. He again had little money, and while bedridden with a fever learned from a letter that Elizabeth, the former object of his affection, was engaged to a cavalry officer. Riis then returned to New York by selling flat irons along the way. Early journalism. Riis noticed an advertisement by a Long Island newspaper for an editor, applied for and was appointed city editor. He quickly realized why the job had been available: the editor-in-chief was dishonest and indebted. Riis left in 2 weeks. Again unemployed, Riis returned to the Five Points neighborhood. He was sitting outside the Cooper Union one day when the principal of the school where he had earlier learned telegraphy happened to notice him. He said that if Riis had nothing better to do, then the New York News Association was looking for a trainee. After one more night and a hurried wash in a horse trough, Riis went for an interview. Despite his disheveled appearance, he was sent for a test assignment, to observe and write about a luncheon at the Astor House. Riis covered the event competently and got the job. Riis was able to write about both the rich and life in impoverished immigrant communities. He did his job well and was able to become editor of a weekly newspaper, The News. However, this newspaper, the periodical of a political group, soon became bankrupt. Simultaneously, and unusually, Riis got a letter from home which related that both his older brothers, an aunt, and Elizabeth Kjawatiz's Vienna Pickerville copyright had died. Riis wrote to Elizabeth to propose, and with $75 of his savings and promissory notes, he bought the news company. Riis worked hard at his newspaper and soon paid his debts. Newly independent, he was able to target the politicians who had previously been his employers. Meanwhile, he received a provisional acceptance from Elizabeth, who asked him to come to Denmark for her, saying, "We will strive together for all that is noble and good." Conveniently, The politicians offered to buy back the newspaper for 5 times the price Riis had paid. He was thus able to arrive in Denmark with a substantial amount of money. After some months in Denmark, the newly married couple arrived in New York. Riis worked briefly as editor of a South Brooklyn newspaper, the Brooklyn News. To supplement his income, he used a magic lantern projector to advertise in Brooklyn, projecting either onto a sheet hung between 2 trees or onto a screen behind a window. The novelty was a success, and Riis and a friend relocated to upstate New York and Pennsylvania as itinerant advertisers. However, this enterprise ended when the pair became involved in an armed dispute between striking railroad workers and the police. Riis quickly returned to New York City. Years at the Tribune, a neighbor of Riis, who was the city editor of the New York Tribune, recommended Riis for a short-term contract. Riis did well, and was offered the job of police reporter. He was based in a press office across from police headquarters on Mulberry Street. Nicknamed Death's Thoroughfare, Riis biographer Alexander Allen writes, "It was here, where the street crooks its elbow at the 5 Points, that the streets and numerous alleys radiated in all directions, forming the foul core of the New York slums." During these stints as a police reporter, Riis worked the most crime-ridden and impoverished slums of the city. Through his own experiences in the poorhouses, and witnessing the conditions of the poor in the city slums, he decided to make a difference for them. Working night shift duty in the immigrant communities of Manhattan's Lower East Side, Riis developed a tersely melodramatic writing style and he became one of the earliest reformist journalists. Photography. Riis had for some time been wondering how to show the squalor of which he wrote more vividly than his words could express. He tried sketching, but was incompetent at this. Camera lenses of the 1880s were slow as was the emulsion of photographic plates. Photography thus did not seem to be of any use for reporting about conditions of life in dark interiors. In early 1887, however, Riis was startled to read that a way had been discovered, to take pictures by flashlight. The darkest corner might be photographed that way. The German innovation, by Adolf Meif and Johannes Geidig, flash powder was a mixture of magnesium with potassium chlorate and some antimony sulfide for added stability. The powder was used in a pistol-like device that fired cartridges. This was the introduction of flash photography. Recognizing the potential of the flash, Riis informed a friend, Dr. John Neagle, chief of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in the City Health Department, who was also a keen amateur photographer. Neagle found 2 more photographer friends, Henry Pifford and Richard Hoe Lawrence, and the 4 of them began to photograph the slums. Their first report was published in the New York newspaper The Sun on February 12, 1888. It was an unsigned article by Riis which described its author as an energetic gentleman, who combines in his person, though not in practice, the 2 dignities of deacon in a Long Island church and a police reporter in New York. The pictures of Gotham's crime and misery by night and day are described as a foundation for a lecture called The Other Half, How It Lives and Dies in New York. To give at church and Sunday school exhibitions, and the like. The article was illustrated by 12-line drawings based on the photographs. Riis and his photographers were among the first Americans to use flash photography. Pistol lamps were dangerous and looked threatening, and would soon be replaced by another method for which Riis lit magnesium powder on a frying pan. The process involved removing the lens cap, igniting the flash powder and replacing the lens cap. The time taken to ignite the flash powder sometimes allowed a visible image blurring created by the flash. Riis' first team soon tired of the late hours, and Riis had to find other help. Both his assistants were lazy and one was dishonest, selling plates for which Riis had paid. Riis sued him in court successfully. Neagle suggested that Riis should become self-sufficient, so in January 1888 Riis paid $25 for a 4A5-box camera, plate holders, a tripod and equipment for developing and printing. He took the equipment to the Potter's Field Cemetery on Hart Island to practice, making 2 exposures. The result was seriously overexposed but successful. For some 3 years Riis combined his own photographs with others commissioned of professionals, donations by amateurs and purchased lantern slides, all of which formed the basis for his photographic archive. Because so much of the work was done at night, he was able to photograph the worst elements of the New York slums, the dark streets, tenement apartments, and stale beer dives, and documented the hardships faced by the poor and criminal, especially in the vicinity of notorious Mulberry Street. Public speaking, Riis accumulated a supply of photographs and attempted to submit illustrated essays to magazines. But when an editor at Harper's New Monthly magazine said that he liked the photographs but not the writing, and would find another writer, Riis was despondent about magazine publication and instead thought of speaking directly to the public. This was not easy. The obvious venue would be a church, but several churches including Riis' own demurred, fearing either that the talks would offend the churchgoers' sensibilities or that they would offend rich and powerful landlords. However, Adolf Scheifler and Josiah Strong arranged to sponsor Riis' lecture at the Broadway Tabernacle Church. Lacking money, Riis partnered with W.L. Craig, a health department clerk. Riis and Craig's lectures, illustrated with lantern slides, made little money for the pair, but they both greatly increased the number of people exposed to what Riis had to say and also enabled him to meet people who had the power to effect change, notably Charles Henry Parkhurst and an editor of Scribner's magazine, who invited him to submit an illustrated article. Books, an 18-page article by Riis, How the Other Half Lives, appeared in the Christmas 1889 edition of Scribner's magazine. It included 19 of his photographs rendered as line drawings. Its publication brought an invitation to expand the material into an entire book. Riis had already been thinking of writing a book, and began writing it during nights. How the Other Half Lives, subtitled Studies Among the Tenements of New York, was published in 1890. The book reused the 18-line drawings that had appeared in the Scribner's article and also 17 reproductions using the halftone method, and thus, representing the first extensive use of halftone photographic reproductions in a book. How the Other Half Lives sold well and was much quoted. Reviews were generally good, although some reviewers criticized it for oversimplifying and exaggerating. Riis attributed the success to a popular interest in social amelioration stimulated by William Booth's In Darkest England and The Way Out, and also to Ward McAllister's Society as I Have Found It, a portrait of the moneyed class. The book encouraged imitations such as Darkness and Daylight, or Lights and Shadows of New York Life, which somehow appropriated Riis' own photographs. Children of the Poor was a sequel in which Riis wrote of particular children that he had encountered. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt introduced himself to Riis, offering to help his efforts somehow. Upon his 1895 appointment to the presidency of the Board of Commissioners of the New York City Police Department, Roosevelt asked Riis to show him nighttime police work. During their first tour, the pair found that 9 out of 10 patrolmen were missing. Riis wrote about this for the next day's newspaper, and for the rest of Roosevelt's term the force was more attentive. Roosevelt closed the police-managed lodging rooms in which Riis had suffered during his first years in New York. After reading the exposure copyright S, Roosevelt was so deeply affected by Riis' sense of justice that he befriended Riis for life, later remarking, "Jacob Riis, whom I am tempted to call the best American I ever knew, although he was already a young man when he came hither from Denmark." After Roosevelt became president, he wrote a tribute to Riis that started. For his part, Riis wrote a campaign biography of Roosevelt that praised him. Public Works. A particularly important effort by Riis was his exposure of the condition of New York's water supply. His 5-column story Some Things We Drink, in the 21st August 1891 edition of the New York Evening Sun, included 6 photographs. Riis wrote, "The story resulted in the purchase by New York City of areas around the New Croton Reservoir, and may well have saved New Yorkers from an epidemic of cholera." Riis tried hard to have the slums around 5 Points demolished and replaced with a park. His writings resulted in the Drexel Committee investigation of unsafe tenements. This resulted in the Small Park Act of 1887. Riis was not invited to the eventual opening of the park on June 15, 1897, but went all the same, together with Lincoln Steffens. In the last speech, The Street Cleaning Commission accredited Riis for the park and led the public in giving him 3 cheers of hooray, Jacob Riis. Other parks also were created, and Riis was popularly credited with them as well. Later life, Riis wrote his autobiography, The Making of an American, in 1901. His daughter, Clara C. Riis, married Dr. William Clarence Fisk. His son, John Riis, served in Gifford Pincoat unregistered trademark as new United States Forest Service from 1907 to 1913 as a ranger and forest supervisor on national forests in Utah, California and Oregon. He chronicled his time in the Forest Service in his 1937 book, Ranger Trail. Another son, Edward V. Riis, was appointed U.S. Director of Public Information in Copenhagen toward the end of World War I. He is known to have spoken publicly against antisemitism. In 1905, Jacob Riis' wife Elizabeth became ill and died. Riis remarried in 1907, and with his new wife, Mary Phillips, relocated to a farm in Barre, Massachusetts. Riis died at the farm on May 26, 1914. His second wife lived until 1967, continuing work on the farm, working on Wall Street and teaching classes at Columbia University. Riis' grave is marked by an unmarked granite boulder in Riverside Cemetery, in Barre, Massachusetts. Social attitudes. Riis' concern for the poor and destitute often caused people to assume he disliked the rich. However, Riis showed no sign of discomfort among the affluent, often asking them for their support. Although seldom involved with party politics, Riis was sufficiently disgusted by the corruption of Tammany Hall to change from being an endorser of the Democratic Party to endorse the Republican Party. The period just before the Spanish-American War was difficult for Riis. He was approached by liberals who suspected that protests of alleged Spanish mistreatment of the Cubans was merely a ruse intended to provide a pretext for U.S. expansionism. Perhaps to avoid offending his friend Roosevelt, Riis refused the offer of good payment to investigate this and made nationalist statements. Riis emphatically supported the spread of wealth to lower classes through improved social programs and philanthropy, but his personal opinion of the natural causes for poor immigrant situations tended to display the trappings of a racist ideology. Several chapters of How the Other Half Lives, for example, open with Riis' observations of the economic and social situations of different ethnic and racial groups via indictments of their perceived natural flaws. Often prejudices that may well have been informed by scientific racism. Criticism. Riis' sincerity for social reform has seldom been questioned, but critics have questioned his right to interfere with the lives and choices of others. His audience comprised middle-class reformers, and critics say that he had no love for the traditional lifestyles of the people he portrayed. Stange argues that Riis recoiled from workers and working-class culture, and appealed primarily to the anxieties and fears of his middle-class audience. Sinti says, Riis was quite impatient with most of his fellow immigrants. He was quick to judge and condemn those who failed to assimilate, and he did not refrain from expressing his contempt. Garock says Riis was insensitive to the needs and fears of East European Jewish immigrants who flooded into New York at this time. Economist Thomas Sowell argues that immigrants during Riis' time were typically willing to live in cramped, unpleasant circumstances as a deliberate short-term strategy that allowed them to save more than half their earnings to help family members come to America, with every intention of relocating to more comfortable lodgings eventually. Many tenement renters physically resisted the well-intentioned relocation efforts of reformers like Riis, states Sowell, because other lodgings were too costly to allow for the high rate of savings possible in the tenements. Moreover, according to Sowell, Riis' own personal experiences were the rule rather than the exception during his era. Like most immigrants and low-income persons, he lived in the tenements only temporarily before gradually earning more income and relocating to different lodgings. Riis' depictions of various ethnic groups can be harsh. As portrayed in Riis' books, the Jews are nervous and inquisitive, the Orientals are sinister, the Italians are unsanitary. Writings, books, How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York. New York, Charles Scribner's Sons 1890. The Children of the Poor. New York, Charles Scribner's Sons 1892. Nipsey's Christmas. New York, Charles Scribner's Sons 1893, Out of Mulberry Street, Stories of Tenement Life in New York City. New York, Century 1896, A 10 Years' War, An Account of the Battle with the Slum in New York. New York, Houghton Mifflin 1900, The Making of an American. New York, Macmillan. 1901, The Battle with the Slum. New York, Houghton, Mifflin 1901, Children of the Tenements. New York, Houghton, Mifflin 1903, The Peril and the Preservation of the Home, being the William L. Bull Lectures for the year 1903. Philadelphia, George W. Jacobs. 1903, Is There a Santa Claus? New York, Macmillan. 1904, Theodore Roosevelt, The Citizen. New York, Outlook 1904, The Old Town. New York, Macmillan. 1909, Hero Tales of the Far North. New York, Macmillan. 1910, Neighbors, Life Stories of the Other Half. New York, Macmillan. 1914, Christmas Stories. An anthology of fiction for younger readers. New York, Macmillan. 1923, Other, How We Found Our Farm. The World's Work, A History of Our Time 23, 475 €479 February 1912, Memorials, Jacob Riis Park, on Rockaway Peninsula in the Gateway National Recreation Area, Queens, Jacob Riis Triangle, in Richmond Hill, Queens, Jacob Riis Playground, at Babbage and 116th Streets, 85 Ave, Queens, PS. 126. The Jacob Riis Community School, on Catherine Street in New York City, is a public PK-5 school. From 1915 until 2002, Jacob Riis Public School on South Throop Street in Chicago was a high school operated by the Chicago School Board. Jacob Riis Settlement House, a multi-service community-based organization, is in the Queensbridge Houses, in Long Island City, Queens, NY. Jacob Riis Houses of NYCHA at Avenue D. Jacob Riis Park Historic District is a historic district that was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1981. Riis Park on Chicago's northwest side in the Galewood-Montclair neighborhood. Veneration, Riis is honored together with Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden with a feast day on the liturgical calendar of the Episcopal Church on July 2. Notes. References: Alland, Alexander. Jacob A. Riis, photographer and citizen. Millerton, New York: Aperture, 1993. ISBN 0-89381-527-6, Bikes-Inti, Tom. The Other Half, The Life of Jacob Riis and the World of Immigrant America 331 pp. ISBN 978-0-393-06023-2, Dowling, Robert M. Slumming in New York, From the Waterfront to Mythic Harlem. University of Illinois Press, 2008. ISBN 0-252-07632-X, Pascal, Janet B. Jacob Riis, Reporter and Reformer. New York, Oxford University Press, 2005. ISBN 0-19-514527-5, Romero Escriva, Rebecca. Las dos mitades de Jacob Riis. Un estudio comparativo de su obra literaria y fotográfica. La Laguna, Cuadernos de Bellas Artes, Volumes 28 and 29. Sociedad Latina de Comunicación Cubed en Social, 2014. ISBN 978-84-15698-47-0/ISBN 978-84-15698-49-4. The two volumes are freely open access, http isicomdocscbar 28 and http isicomdocscbar 29, Romero Escriva, Rebecca. Literatura y Fotografía, Las dos mitades de Jacob Riis. En Archivos de la Filmoteca. Revista de Estudios Históricos sobre la Imagen, N. 67, April 2011, ppA 170-193. ISSN 0214-6606. Available online here. Romero Escriva, Rebecca. Riis, Carper, Rosenthal. Traductions cinematográficas de la fotografía. In late Atlanti. Revista de Estudios Cinematográficos, N. 8, July 2009, ppA 124-133. ISSN 1885-3730. Available online here. Stange, Maron. Symbols of Ideal Life, Social Documentary Photography in America, 1890-1915. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1989. Stange, Maron, Jacob Riis and Urban Visual Culture, Journal of Urban History, May 1989, Volume 15 Issue 3, ppA 274-303, Stein, Sally, Making Connections with the Camera. Photography and Social Mobility in the Career of Jacob Riis, in After Image, No. 10, May 1983, ppA 9-16. Cienti, Tom. The Other Half, The Life of Jacob Riis and the World of Immigrant America, 2008, PA 157, Where, Louise. Jacob A. Riis, police reporter, reformer, useful citizen. New York, Appleton Century, 1938. Also available here at archive.org. Jochelson, Bonnie and Strom, Daniel, Rediscovering Jacob Riis, Exposure Journalism and Photography in Turn of the Century New York. New York, New Press, 2007. ISBN 978-1-558-199-0, external links, works by Jacob A. Riis at Project Gutenberg, works by Jacob A. Riis at LibriVox, Jacob Riis photographs from the Museum of the City of New York, Jacob Riis page from the Open Collections Program at Harvard University. Immigration to the United States, 1789-1930 collection. Jacob A. Riis New York. New York Times. February 27, 2008. Retrieved August 8, 2008. Davis, K. Documenting the Other Half. The Social Reform Photography of Jacob Riis and Louis Hine, Jacob Riis at Find a Grave, collection of photographs by Jacob Riis, text and images from Riis book How the Other Half Lives, Romero Escriva, Rebecca. Las dos mitades de Jacob Riis. Un estudio comparativo de su obra literaria y fotográfica, volumes 28 and 29 available online. Flash forward, How the Flashbulb Changed the Face of Urban Poverty, article on Riis.